I have a skin condition that my skin reacts to the sun in a bad way.
You know, what the op-ed was about was...
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Behavioral Arts, and this video is going to be a continuation to my series on detecting deception. Now, if you haven't seen the other videos in this series, don't worry about it because there isn't a right order to do this. So you could start with this one, then you could go back to the other ones. They all complement each other because these techniques all work together. In this specific video, we're going to focus on someone that I think at this point everyone in the world knows, and that person is Amber Heard. From hours and hours of footage, I've selected short clips where I think there are very good odds that Amber is being deceptive, and we're going to look at specifically why, and we're going to focus on 5 signs of deception. At the end of the video, I'm going to give you a really powerful psychological technique that you can use in every situation, whether it's social, whether it's your personal life, whether it's at work, to dramatically increase your odds of getting people to tell you the truth in the first place. Now, before we jump into any of this, I want to talk about lie detection as a science the way I always do. This is sort of a disclaimer before we jump into this material. So the truth about human lie detectors is that they do not exist. There is not a single person on this planet who could tell you 100% of the time, just by looking at someone or listening to someone, if they are lying or telling the truth. Movies and television shows really simplify a very complex procedure that is never a perfect science. So how does lie detection work? Well, we do know this. When we're lying, typically, we get more stressed. Lying isn't something we enjoy doing. The second thing we know about lying is that it's much harder and more taxing on the brain than telling the truth. When you tell the truth, it's a 2-step process. Remember the truth, tell the truth, that's it. It's very simple. When we lie, there's a lot more steps. First, we have to remember every other lie we told about the subject to make sure that what we're about to say is consistent with those. Second, we have to fabricate in our head the lie. We have to make it up. You have to get creative. Third, we have to present that lie. Fourth, we have to make sure we're presenting it right and we're not slipping up and we seem confident, so we're very aware of ourselves. And finally, we have to scan our audience to make sure that the lie is being well received. Because the brain is so much busier when we're lying than telling the truth, there are certain signs we might see when someone's being deceptive that their brain has slowed down a little bit. Now, as great as that is to know, deception presents a very particular challenge to behavioral analysts like myself, and that is the fact that there isn't a single thing that every human being does when they're being deceptive. It's so funny because often in my comments, I'll get people who say something like, oh, he looked up and to the right when he said that, he's obviously lying, or he crossed his arms as he was saying that, so that's obviously a lie. Those are complete myths. There isn't a single thing you can see someone do and say to yourself, that person is for sure lying. So how do we detect deception? Well, although there's nothing that will ever allow us to know that someone is for sure lying, there are 2 things that we must keep in mind before we look at today's tips that will allow us to know when someone might be lying, that there's an increased probability that someone's lying. And those 2 things are clusters and baseline. Clusters basically remind us that no single sign of deception means anything alone. If it's alone, if it's isolated, it means nothing. So to increase our confidence that somebody might be deceptive, we have to see all these behaviors in clusters. We have to see several of these signs at the same time. So today I'm going to give you 5 great signs that you could see, and you can add those to the signs I gave in the other videos, and when you see multiple of these at the same time, now you have a cluster and there's a higher probability of deception. The second thing is baseline, someone's behavior under normal, non-stressful circumstances. So every now and then I'll get a comment when I'm giving these signs of deception if someone might say, oh my God, you said, that's a deceptive behavior, but I do that all the time. Well, if you do it all the time, it's meaningless. It's part of your baseline. And that applies to the tips today. Okay, so now we know how deception works. Let's jump right into today's tips, all of which focus on the face. So all of these are nonverbal signs. In other words, it's something that we're seeing, not something the person is saying, and they're all on the face. So I'm going to show you some clips now of Amber Heard in interviews on the stand during her deposition. And I want you to take some notes. You might want to write them down. You might pause and go back and look at it a couple of times. Focus on her face. Now, the great thing about Amber Heard is that her baseline is really not out of the norm. She doesn't have any behaviors that happen regularly when she's just talking, without any stress, that I would tell you have to pay attention to because it's not an indication of anything. Her baseline is pretty standard. So pay attention to what's happening on her face, some behaviors that are happening. I don't want to give too many clues, and try to see if there's anything here that would indicate to you that maybe she's experiencing some stress, or maybe her brain is slowing down. What's going on with her behaviors? Take a look.
And then I put another foundation on because it has sunblock in it. I have a skin condition that my skin reacts to the sun in a bad way. So I have to wear sunscreen or sunblock. And no woman wants to walk around with a bruise on her face. And then if you want to cover up a bruise, you obviously put foundation first, concealer, and then on top of that, I used a bruise kit. Not a bruise kit, it's a theater makeup kit, a color correction kit, but I called it my bruise kit. Yeah, this is what I was talking about as a color correction kit. This is not obviously the exact one I used to carry, but I used to carry it with me all the time.
Because the op-ed wasn't about my relationship with Johnny.
But it alluded to him. It was unmistakable.
What the op-ed was about was, me loaning my voice to a bigger cultural conversation that we were having at the time.
I honestly don't remember if I threw anything in his direction. I don't think I did. I just remember him having me by the nightgown. I remember him flailing me, throwing me around. I'm flailing.
When I say reach, I'm specifically saying I would like him to know information coming from me or coming from Jerry, from me, so that he finds out about the divorce filing or my intention to do so from some other source other than TMZ, which was alerted.
Okay, so there it was. Now, I'm telling you right now, there were several mega clusters there. I'm talking like more than 8 or 9 signs of deception, but we're focusing on 5 specific ones today. So take a sec, go down to the comments and let me know, what signs of deception did you see? Are there things that you think in her behavior that all happen at the same time indicate that she might be deceptive? Remember, deception often means we're looking for stress or signs that the brain is being overworked. So what did you see? Now, if you want to list in your comment verbal signs, things that she said that could indicate deception, or other signs that we covered in previous videos, please go ahead. I want to see how many signs of deception you're going to spot in the videos that we just saw, and then come back and we're going to jump into the 5 main ones that we're covering today, all of which are nonverbal cues on the face. All right, so we're going to start with one of my favorite things to look out for, and one of the biggest indications that there is an increased cognitive load. In other words, someone's brain is being overworked, and it's something that often comes up in a lot of my analysis videos, and I'm really excited to include it now to the official list of indicators of deception, and it is the eye flutter. Now, in every single video that we just saw, with the exception of the deposition, with the exception of the one with the blue background, in every other clip we saw, Amber Heard suddenly had enormously increased eye flutters. And this is something that a lot of behavior analysts and a lot of body language analysts noted with Amber Heard, that she could go hours on the stand without fluttering her eyes. But when certain topics come up where she has to think fast and she's making certain parts up, or it's likely that she's making certain parts up, we saw very, very increased eye flutters. Eye flutter is when we blink really rapidly in succession. So it's different from an increased blink rate. Increased blink rate is when we blink more as we're talking, like this, but it's just more recurring blinks. Eye flutter is quick, like it's hard for me to do, but it's like, and sometimes it's like really lightning fast. And Amber Heard had a lot of those on the stand. The reason eye flutter is important is because when the brain is having a hard time processing information, whether it's something we're gonna say or it's something somebody else said, eye flutter is a very common sort of lag. Chase Hughes, who is the author of 6-Minute X-Ray, one of the best books on profiling and reading body language, and one of the best behavioral analysts in the world, calls this closing the apps on your phone. You know, sometimes when you have like a whole bunch of apps open and just going like this and closing the apps, that's the equivalent of an eye flutter. It's sort of like, you're just sort of like trying to navigate and close things and try to figure out which app you're trying to get to, and we see that flutter. Also note that eye flutter is very common in pre-aggression. Before someone gets aggressive, we often see an eye flutter as they're getting worked up, and it is a great indicator of deception. Alone, no. In a cluster, 2 thumbs up. All right, now we're gonna go to the 4 other tips and an incredible technique that will get people to tell you the truth more often. So you won't need any of these signs of deception because people are just gonna tell you the truth. But before we do me a huge favor, hit that subscribe button, turn those notifications on for more practical psychology content. All right, let's stick to the eyes, the windows of the soul, for the second tip, the second indicator of deception, and that is slow blinks. This is another one that I really like to look for because I focus a lot on the face, and slow blinks is something we see very often in deception. Again, always remember, alone, it could mean nothing, but in a cluster, it's very valuable. Slow blink is typically when someone's talking and all of a sudden they close their eyes as they say something. Sometimes the eyebrows go down like this, sometimes the eyebrows go up like this. Now the reason clusters are important is very apparent with slow blinks because slow blinks can also happen when we're simply focusing on something that's absolutely real. As I recall something that happened, you might see me do this. I'm closing my eyes to be able to imagine it better. But it also happens in deception for 2 reasons. The first reason is that we subconsciously don't want to see the reactions of the people that we're lying to. We don't like to disappoint people. We don't like to make people sad or angry in most cases. So this is sort of like I don't want to see the effects of my lie. I just want to get this over with. The second reason is because we don't want to face our own lie. The fact that we're lying, we don't want to face it. Notice how when something happens that we have a hard time with, someone gives you some bad news or someone says something sad, you might close your eyes and just, I don't want to deal with this. And the same happens with a lie. We don't want to face the lie. We don't want to deal with the lie. Eye blocking or slow blinking often happens with things that we just don't want to deal with. We don't want to face, we want to get it over with. Speaking of not facing things or having a hard time looking at things, here's a fun little quiz, true or false question about lie detection. Is the following statement true or false? Liars more often break eye contact and look away. Is that true or false? Take a second and think about it. For whatever reason, is it true that in most cases, someone who's lying is going to break eye contact and look away? Well, you might be surprised to find out that despite what a lot of popular culture thinks, that statement is absolutely false. In fact, there's a ton of research on this, some great research from Aldrich Vray, some great research from Samantha Mann, and they indicate that liars often increase eye contact. They look at the person, and there's 2 theories as to why this happens. One, because the myth that liars look away is so well spread and so well known, they purposely keep eye contact to convince you that they're telling the truth. Second, they're looking at you as a confirmation glance to see if their lie is working and they want to make sure. So going back to the slow blink, this is a subconscious gesture. Nobody is slow blinking willingly or knowing that they're doing it. It's a subconscious gesture that happens when they don't want to see that reaction, when they're not ready to face the disappointment that their lie has caused. So even if consciously they're trying to keep that eye contact, they might get that slow blink because they're just having a hard time facing this. So looking away, not a sign of deception. Slow blink, eye blocking, sign of deception. All right, now we're going to travel south from the eyes and land boom on the mouth. One of the other areas of the face that we pay a lot of attention to during deception because the mouth is where the words come out from and we get a lot of really great subconscious signals from the lips and the mouth that indicate when a lie might be taking place. Now, if some of you in your comments earlier, when you tried to figure out what indications of deception there were, talked about the lip biting that she had or the lip compressions that she had, which is when the lips thin out. Good job, you've been paying attention. Virtual high fives, yay! But today we're talking about lip licking. So when we're being deceptive, lip licking is a very common sign. Now there are 3 reasons lip licking might happen during deception, and the third one's going to look a little bit different than the first 2, but let's look at what those reasons are. The first reason is simply stress. Remember how we talked about earlier, when you're being deceptive, you're feeling more stress. Well, when we're stressed, the mouth dries up, and lip licking is a way to correct that. So if somebody isn't licking their lips during a conversation, so their baseline does not involve lip licking, and then all of a sudden, with a cluster of other behaviors that we're looking at today or in the other videos, we start to see increased lip licking, it could be because the stress has spiked and they're trying to correct that. The second reason we might lip lick in deception is grooming. So grooming gestures is anything where we fix our appearance. Men might adjust their cuffs, they might adjust their ties, Women might fix their hair, adjust their jewelry. We might clean our clothes or like pick lint or things like this. These are all contributors to a cluster of deception because we're making ourselves look more presentable so that our lie will be believed more. Often, not always. Sometimes we actually just want to look good. But if it happens in a cluster, super important. So that's the second reason we might see lip licking as a grooming gesture, because it brings more color to the lips and makes us look more presentable. The third reason is actually embedded in our DNA ever since we are babies. So you'll notice whenever you feed a baby something it doesn't like, an unpleasant taste, you'll notice the baby will scrunch the face and the tongue will go like this. This is us trying to expel something unpleasant. So whenever we have something in our mouth that we don't like the taste of, that's the way we get that taste out of our mouth. But it also happens with unpleasant thoughts as a completely subconscious gesture. So if something we've said or something we've heard or a thought leaves a bad taste in our mouth, obviously metaphorically a bad taste in our mouth, we might see this sort of, it's a bit of a tighter lip. So the first two, the grooming or the stress, it's more of a quick, relaxed lip lick. But sometimes you'll see it with a tighter lip and it'll just be like this kind of thing. And that's us trying to expel an unpleasant thought. So whether it is stress, grooming, or the pushing out of a disgusting thought, lip licking is a very good indicator of deception within a cluster. The next sign of deception is one of the best examples as to why clusters are enormously important, because this can happen isolated for a ton of other reasons than deception, but within a cluster, it does indicate to the likelihood of deception, and it is face touching. So with Amber Heard, throughout her trial, she rarely touched her face. Her hands rarely came up. But in these clusters of deception that we saw throughout her testimonies, every now and then we would see that face touch, including the one that we saw in the previous video, where it wasn't just a small, quick nose touch. It was a full palm, like upward sweep. Like it was a very obvious touching of the nose in the midst of a giant cluster of deception. So why does touching the face indicate deception? Well, almost every body language expert on the planet will tell you that they pay close attention to hand-to-face gestures. I can't think of a single body language analyst or behavioral analyst who would tell you that that's not something that's very important to them. I think all over the map, it's something we pay attention to. There's also a ton of research that indicates that in stress and in deception, we touch the face more often, but there's a bit of disagreement as to why. In fact, there are two schools of thought on this that are pretty much opposites. And I personally believe that they can both coexist depending on the situation. Different situations cause different things. The first theory is that when we're lying, we're stressed. We already covered that. Pretty much everyone agrees. And when we're stressed, our body goes into fight or flight response. Basically, our limbic system is activated and we become purely reactive and instinct-based. Now, when this happens, blood usually rushes to the organs to make sure that we're prepared to run away, to fight. So the blood goes to the heart, to the lungs, to make sure that we can stay active. So a lot of psychologists believe that blood rushes away from our face, from the extremities, from the ears, from the nose, in order to supply more blood to the organs, and that blood rush away causes an itching, which is why we see that face touching. The other school of thought is pretty much the opposite of that. Not that the blood is rushing away, but it's rushing towards the face. Because once again, in fight or flight response, we need to breathe more, whether we're gonna fight or whether we're gonna run away. So blood goes to the nose so that it guarantees that it's more effective, that we breathe more effectively. And so the rush of blood going to the nose causes an itching sensation. So now we're all left thinking like, come on, can the psychologists get their story straight because they're pretty much opposite explanations and they can't coexist? Well, actually they can. So the University of Granada conducted the most extensive research on this and found that both those things can happen in deception. So in a lot of cases when we lie, blood does rush to the nose, and it's called the Pinocchio Effect because that blood rush, that blood supply causes a negligible increase in the size of the nose, and it's like Pinocchio's nose grows when he lies, but thermal scans do indicate that in deception, the nose can get hotter. But in that very same research, they found that if the lie involves us thinking a lot more, remember what we've been saying about the cognitive load, and you have to process more, think more, in those cases, blood rushes away from the face and to the brain. So the thermal scans show colder around the nose and hotter at the forehead. And this has been really reliable in the research. So depending on the type of lie, blood might rush to the nose or away from the nose. But in either case, that can cause face touching. So even if we're not 1,000% sure what the cause is when we're analyzing behavior, face touching is a great part of a cluster of deception. The fifth and final indicator of deception that we're going to be looking at today, before we move on to my top secret truth extracting secret technique is mouth blocking. So we talked about face touching, right? So whenever somebody touches their face within a cluster, that's going to indicate to the heightened probability of deception. But this is a very specific kind of face touching that to me is going to count as an extra point. So when this happens, it's +1 for the face touch, +2 if it's a mouth block. So if that facial touch is not only, something like this, but it blocks the mouth in any way. So earlier we saw Amber Heard as she was touching her nose. Obviously the hand is in front of the mouth. And then in that deposition, when she let slip that she had talked to TMZ, we saw one of the most colossally disastrous mouth blocks I've ever seen, where both her hands came up and then she realized, oh my God, that's not a good look. So she went for a face touch and groomed her hair. So it was going to be a mouth block. Well, it was turned into grooming and face touching. So why is mouth block important? Well, it's important because it's been there ever since we've been children. You ever see a child say something they're not supposed to say, whether it's a bad word or someone else's secret? What's the most common thing we see? Eyes open up, both hands come up to the mouth, and they usually gasp. Or like, oh, and this is them trying to stop with both hands that thought from coming out, even if it's too late. Well, as we age, we become more subtle about it. With teenagers, we often see things along these lines. So it's not necessarily both hands coming up, but one hand blocking the mouth. And as adults, we become even better at it. We might touch the nose, we might play with the corners of the mouth like this, but again, it's the hand coming up subtly to keep a thought or an idea in. When famous actor Andrew Garfield was on The Tonight Show talking to Jimmy Fallon and denying his involvement in Spider-Man No Way Home, throughout the entire interview, face touching or mouth blocking was not all that common for him. But when he started to deny being involved in the movie, which at the time was a huge secret, all of a sudden the face touching and the mouth blocking spiked. He did it a lot. Now he's a really, really good liar, and there weren't massive clusters there. There was, I would say, small clusters of deception, but mouth blocking and face touching were definitely there, and they were also there in other interviews where he was denying his involvement in the movie. So you can see how even with a good liar, sometimes that face touching and mouth blocking is still very present. And sometimes you'll see it in a lie that's not a full-on deceptive statement, but what we call lies of omission, something the person doesn't want to say, so they're not telling you the whole truth. So we might see, the slow blink or the flutter with a bit of this, even when they're not saying anything, because they're omitting information. So we're not only looking for these behaviors when someone's talking, but we're also looking when they're listening, when they're reacting, when they're formulating thought. This is why you never really give yourself a break when you're interviewing or interrogating someone with the intention of getting the truth. Because yes, although the cluster is most likely to show up immediately before or immediately after a deceptive statement, it can also happen while they're processing a question or reacting to something. Their guard might be down, a cluster might show up. So really stay observant, don't be distracted, keep your eyes on the person as you're having these conversations, and look for these clusters at any point, although you do want to pay a little more attention to just before and just after the statement was made. Oh, by the way, really quick but very important note. Do the clusters of deception that we're seeing in Amber Heard mean for a fact that she's lying? In other words, whether it's the indicators of deception that we're talking about today or all the other indicators of deception that we've talked about that we're seeing in these videos that create mega clusters of deception, does it mean for sure she's lying? Absolutely not. It just means that there's a higher probability of deception in those moments because a lot of these things are happening. So in an interrogation or in an interview, when I see those things, I wouldn't be like, interview over, I saw a cluster, that's a lie, lock her up. It would just give me a reason to want to ask more questions about this topic, to dig deeper here, but clusters are never the end result. just a really good indication that there might be deception happening here, heightened probability that deception is happening here. All right, now it's time for the really practical way to increase your odds of getting the truth out of people in the first place. So you don't have to apply lie detection techniques or look for clusters, because this will increase your odds of getting the truth. And I use this technique in almost every interview I ever do. It's pretty much protocol for me, and I can't say enough good things about it. So the technique comes in two parts, and it can be applied to pretty much any situation, and here's what they are. The first part is, you're not going to ask the person the question that they're likely to lie about first. You're going to lead up to it with questions that are related to the topic, but not the main question that you want to know the answer to. And we'll talk about how to do this with an example very soon. The second part is, when they answer one of those lead-up questions, you're going to thank them for their honesty. And I don't mean you're going to say thank you, you're going to say thank you for your honesty in those words. Let me give you an example. Let's say I work in HR or high up in a company where there was a company party a couple of days ago and somebody lost their wallet. And we think somebody stole it, and I've been tasked with finding out who was involved. So I'm going to interview every person who was at the party, every employee who was there, one at a time. Now during this interview, I don't want to sit the person down and be like, hey, how are you? How's it going? Did you steal a wallet? There's a lot of disadvantages to that. And the main one being that if you ask something so confrontational out of the blue, their stress might spike even if they're telling the truth, because it's a stressful question. So if they're not eased into the topic, all of a sudden you might see clusters of deception, signs of stress, and you might think they're being deceptive when they're not. So again, step one is, I'm going to start by talking about that evening and that something happened to ease into it slowly. But there's a lot of other advantages. So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to ask something, for example, like, so you may or may not know, but something happened that night, and I'm talking to everyone to try to get a sense of what happened. And I just want to know what your experience was that night. Were you drinking a lot? Did you have a lot of drinks? And they might answer, yeah, I had a couple of beers, or I had a couple of martinis, whatever. And my immediate response to that is going to be, oh, great. And by the way, I want to thank you for your honesty. I really appreciate you being honest with me. Then I'm going to go on with other related questions. And again, after a question or two, I might once again say, thank you for your honesty, or I appreciate your honesty, or I appreciate you being honest with me. And I'll keep going with a few more. And then eventually I'll bring up the topic of the wallet. This technique alone of asking leading up questions and thanking them for their honesty will dramatically increase your odds of them being truthful when that question comes up. But why? Well, the main reason is something that has two terms that are very closely related in psychology, and it's either called labeling, which is something I talked about very recently in a persuasion video, or attribution. And they're both very similar. In fact, in this case, they're pretty much the same thing. Basically, what attribution and labeling mean, and this has been thoroughly studied, is that when you attribute a positive label to someone, they are more likely to act consistent with that label because they focus on that part of themselves. In other words, we all have the capacity to be truthful, and when we focus on the truthfulness, the honest part of ourselves, it causes us to be more honest. One of my favorite studies on this subject was conducted by researchers Miller, Brickman, and Bolin, and they discovered that in a school, when a classroom of children was told how neat and tidy they are, and they were reminded this by various staff and faculty of the school, it led them to being significantly more tidy and neat, picking things up, throwing things in the trash as opposed to just throwing it on the ground, because they focused on that part of themselves. Basically, the way this works is it creates a label. When you're told you're neat and tidy, not only do you identify more with that part of yourself, but you want to stay consistent with that, because as humans, we have a basic need to stay consistent. And again, there's been so much research done on this. The American Cancer Society found that they can increase donations by 800% if they call someone generous or charitable before they ask for a donation. Because again, that gets the person to focus on that generous part of themselves, and they want to behave consistently. And it's the same with lie detection. When you tell someone, thank you for your honesty, or I appreciate you being honest with me, and by the way, I'm not making it up. I'm actually very thankful that they're being honest. In an interview setting, honesty is the biggest currency. And I'm honestly very thankful for that honesty, and and I'm just expressing that. But the moment I do that, it creates this badge of honor that they wear proudly, a badge that says honesty. Just like the badge of being generous, just like the badge of being neat and tidy, they don't want to lose this honor, especially because I'm placing so much emphasis on it and telling them how important honesty is to me. It's more important than anything you may have done during a party without thinking about it. That's not important. What's important is honesty, and you're an honest person. So they wear that proudly and want to behave consistently with that label. Furthermore, by commenting on the honesty, it brings that honesty into the light. Just like the school children who were more neat or tidy, just because they were focusing on that part of their identity, this person, quite simply because honesty is being brought into the light, will act more honestly, more openly, and more truthfully. Oh, and of course, how could I forget? Another huge reason this works is operant conditioning. Anyone who took a high school psychology class will remember operant conditioning by B.F. Skinner, where he had rats in a box, and if they did an activity that they were supposed to, they were rewarded, and if they did an activity they weren't supposed to, they were punished, and there's different variations of that. I'll leave a link in the description. Don't want to go into all the details, but we learned that if you reward good behavior, it happens more often. So just a simple fact that not even the honesty, but you're saying thank you, that's a reward. They're being rewarded for honesty, and so they're more likely to be honest. So once again, quite simply, if you need to get the truth out of someone, don't start right away with the incriminating question. Talk about the topic, lead up to it with smaller questions that give you a little bit more information, and thank them for their honesty. I love the line, I appreciate your honesty. I want to thank you for being honest with me. It just really sets up a great positive vibe, opens the door to honesty, and increases those odds of them being truthful when you ask the big question. So there it was. I hope you enjoyed the 5 indicators of deception that we looked at today, as well as the technique to get people to be more truthful with you more often, which once again I've used with amazing results. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this. Also, let me know what other indicators of deception that we've covered on the channel you saw in those clips of Amber Heard. Even if it's just as a refresher, I think it's great to constantly even look at the same clips that we've looked at before and see if we're catching more and more things as we learn more about deception. In the description, I will leave links to a lot of the studies I was talking about today, as well as some of my favorite books on detecting lies, and I will see you on the next one.